I'm Bonnie Colby in Agricultural and Resource Economics, and thanks for being here at the CLIMAS Colloquium. Myself and Gigi, also active on the CLIMAS team, will be talking about different aspects of evaluation, evaluating environmental water acquisitions in my case, and evaluating CLIMAS activities and regional climate services in Gigi's case. I had fun meeting and sharing our war stories of different experiences with evaluation. So when a program evaluator walks into a room, everybody sits up a little straighter. They all know who they are because they're the ones who rate whether programs are accomplishing what they have set out to accomplish and have a lot of influence potentially over funding and other matters. So it was fun comparing notes on the different contexts in which we work with this. And a couple of cross-cutting themes that we came up with in our conversations were use-inspired science and evaluation. In my case, evaluation of programs to acquire water for the environment. What kind of criteria do evaluation metrics satisfy? What are they going to be used for? They need to be something that has a practical application. Otherwise, it's just a burden on all the people who have to participate in the evaluation process. The other thing that we notice is a common enjoyable theme in both of our work related to evaluation in different settings is there these communities of practice, people from lots of different disciplines, from inside and outside academia, who are learning to evaluate the work they're doing in new ways, ways that are more fresh, more useful, and they're learning together because fortunately you don't see a lot of people who say, I've really got this down and this is how we need to do it. There's a lot of exploration in it, and that makes it fun. So I'm going to be focusing on evaluating environmental water acquisitions, and I've got my thank yous to the different several different projects over the past 5 to 6 years, the different project sponsors, including several foundations that have been really enjoyable to work with, who have their own evaluation teams, and then lots of public agencies, and of course the CLIMAS team here, which Gigi will be giving more background on for anyone who isn't familiar with it in the room. So this is a favorite topic for me. It's certainly a pressing issue. Some of you I know from my graduate classes or the graduate program in which I'm a professor, people from all over the world. There's not a continent or really a country in which water for the environment isn't a pressing issue. A pressing issue in terms of environmental impacts themselves, but also how regional economies are functioning, how people are earning livelihoods, and what the future is going to be like for coming generations in those regions in terms of ability to live there, have safe drinking water, have access to recreation, be able to grow food, and so on. So a really pressing issue. The other thing I really like about it is because it's a field that's evolving, it's not very fixed in place. We're always learning, and that tends to be really enjoyable, keep people awake and highly interactive with each other. It's become increasingly sophisticated over 30 years. And when I speak of sophisticated, you'll see that I mean that from various economic points of views. Other of you would have a different definition, but things are being done in a more fine-tuned way over my professional lifetime in this field. It's really great to see that growth and evolution. And for those of you in the room under 40, there is still so much work to do. So
even those of us over 40, there's a lot of work to do.
True. But there's decades and decades of work to do. And so environmental water acquisitions are also really important in the CLIMAS context because they're important in thinking about how do regions adapt to different temperature regimes, different hydrologic regimes. We know that we're losing snowpack, for example, in this part of the Southwest, so the pattern of water runoff, how much is being stored in reservoirs versus snowpack is changing. Our water demands are changing as a result of temperature, and the amount of water available in streams and wetlands to support all kinds of important services important to humans, that's all in shift. And so thinking about how we restore and preserve the services that water in natural settings is providing is a big part of adaptation and thinking about future viability of regions. Some of the important services that water provides in rivers, wetlands, and lakes is improved water quality, meaning the city doesn't have to spend as much to pre-treat the water at its treatment plants. Flood protection, keeping the floodplain healthy and able to absorb floodwaters is part of these programs. Community and cultural values even in Tucson, where rivers are dry a lot of the year, what do we see along the washes in the early mornings? People are out there riding and running, walking with a friend. So these are important for recreation and quality of community life. And some of the interesting studies that myself and my graduate students have enjoyed doing over the years is the property value impacts of healthy, viable river systems and lake settings and so on. We had did some really interesting studies here where we found that the natural riparian corridors that had more mature vegetation, shade trees, and so on contributed a lot to property values, competing on a value of water basis with golf courses, which we also know in general create premium for homes near them. So it's kind of fun to see the trade-offs in different ways of using water and how they affect homeowners and their property values. And then the recreation renewal I've already referred to, and of course the obligation under various regulations to recover species and to protect their habitats is very much facilitated by water and natural waterways. So a couple of my objectives. I really need to talk about the evaluation component, but I do want to give you a little feel for environmental water acquisition programs because probably most of you aren't familiar with them. The role of the public and the private sector and of nonprofit organizations and advocacy organizations has changed a lot over 20 to 30 years, and the role of foundations coming in to this realm. And then talk about a little bit about evaluation approaches, give you a few examples of evaluation metrics, not much detail, just to see if anybody takes the bait of saying, oh, this is really interesting. I think I might want to do more of this. And then moving forward, what are those challenges that really are still ahead in spite of all the progress over the time I've been working in this field. And another objective definitely infects some of you with enthusiasm for this work. I got bit by the water bug as an undergraduate working for the state of California on water issues in agriculture, and it really stayed with me. It's one of those things that gets in your system. So some of you who are still thinking about what you want to focus on next or what you want to do after graduation, that is part of my agenda as well. So water for the environment. In the early years, the goal, so this would have been the 1970s and 1980s, and I'm confining this talk to the Western United States just because it's a short talk. The goal was simply to be able to have property rights to hold water for in-stream flow purposes. None of the Western states had that as of the early 1970s. And so the superheroes at that time were the lawyers. So this is a really exciting time for legal advocacy. But economists also had a very interesting role because we had two things that we were documenting. One is that water in streams and other natural settings adds economic value in the sense of values given to individuals and communities, but also in the sense of jobs and livelihood. So helping make that connection at legislative hearings. There was one year, I think I went to testified before 6 state legislatures around the West on in-stream flow issues. And you know, that was okay. The talks were okay. There I am, this young economics professor from Arizona before the Montana legislature, which was almost all male and almost wearing big silver belt buckles at that time. And they were polite and they did ask a few questions, so that's a good sign. But where it really broke loose was one of the smartest techniques I learned then and that I've tried to use ever since when I can, is you go walk along the river and spend a little time, do a road trip and point things out and go to the farms that are involved in this too. That's where people really start to say, you know what? I could actually use less water to grow crops, and I'd be happy to take a payment from Trout Unlimited to do that. So it was those field trips and that field work in addition to the formal settings where things really started to make a difference. So the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water Act were being relatively vigorously enforced by the federal government during part of this time. So there was a strong litigation threat. Those of you who think about the role of markets and people voluntarily giving up some of their water in exchange for compensation, if right behind your offer to lease some of their crop irrigation water is a threat from the environmental defense that the water in the courts might rule that the farmers have to give up water without compensation, that's actually really helpful. That very much influences the market. So sometimes we talk about markets as this separate thing that springs up and operates, you know, based on incentives. And that it's true that that happens, but there's also that whole context of threat and bargaining power that really inform how these markets work. And that was very important early on with in-stream flows, that farmers and other major water users had to think that they could be dragged into the court system in order to reduce their water use without compensation And then they were more willing to come to the bargaining table and talk about, well, what can we do to pay you to do some things on your farms differently? So, and the main mechanism at that point in time is a formal transfer of water, a water right that you bought from a farm to in-stream flows, going through a long process, usually a lot of objections. Again, it was full employment for people who specialized in water law at that time. And the in-stream flow requirements were very simple in those days. You just set a section of stream, well-defined, you know, in the legal proceedings, and you picked a flow amount that was supposed to be in that stream year-round. And that was kind of what constituted an in-stream flow, a successful evaluation, a successful in-stream flow accomplishment in that day. And this was primarily what we call buy and dry with respect to irrigated agriculture. That is, you often would have to buy the land because it wouldn't have value if the water rights were being taken off it. So you'd be buying farmland, you'd be buying water rights. It was expensive, it was costly, it was very legalese, and it wasn't very flexible. You were locking up the water that had been used in crop production year round when streams are really short on water seasonally, not year round. So I would say there was a fair amount of waste in that system, but it had the value of people could understand it as a year-round stream flow requirement. Farmland, we know the farm is using less water because guess what? It's barren and growing tumbleweeds. So there was no question about how much less water, that kind of thing. So for a simple starting approach, it was probably a good way to start. But if we move to this point in time, we now have thousands of in-stream flow water rights around the West. They're concentrated in the Pacific Northwest, because what do they have swimming in their rivers up there? I've got the salmon. The salmon generate both a legal impetus and funding sources to acquire water from agriculture and dedicate it to in-stream flows. So we've got thousands of in-stream flow water rights. And, but what we also have that I'm very excited about and have really enjoyed working on and helping design these programs is flexible programs that pay farmers to use their water differently, but they don't mess with the water rights. Boy, your costs are a lot lower if you don't have to go through all those formal legal processes. So this has been the approach that's being taken in a lot of areas now. And it relies on some fairly good faith among the parties and well-written contracts. But I'll give you an example or two. So basically what is being done is paying a particular farmer, maybe a whole irrigation district, sometimes what we call temporary cessation of irrigation, where you stop irrigating your hay and alfalfa in the middle of the summer, when in general it's lower protein content and you get less profit for it anyway. Maybe your yields drop because of heat anyway, and you're able to revive the crop in the fall when the stream is already through its critical period. So look what a fine-tuned approach this is. It thinks about the seasonality of crop production in the different areas of the West where these are being applied. And it thinks about the seasonality of when the stream actually needs water. When the stream doesn't need the water under these agreements, it is used to grow the kind of crops that could be grown in other parts of the agricultural production season. And there's been a real commitment, especially by states like Colorado, to switch away from buy and dry and go to some of these innovative arrangements, putting state money into it as well as money from the advocacy organizations like Nature Conservancy and others that focus on in-stream flow issues. This is one of the high elevation ranchers in Pinedale area of Wyoming who's getting a really good return. One of the things that I do as an agricultural economist is look at what does the water actually generate in crop production in terms of net income to the farmer. So in the early days, farmers were definitely getting 10 to 15 times what they would have earned net above and beyond expenses using that water to grow crops. That's slowly coming down over time because farmers are more interested, there are more of them wanting to participate. But this fellow was still doing very, very well when I looked at the numbers in terms of 6 weeks of not irrigating his hay. Allowed him to pay off some important farm equipment that he's purchased, actually. So the public sector, public agencies have a big role in this. So does the private sector, especially now, and so do the advocacy organizations, which I'm referring to as NGOs, and the foundations. So in the early days, it was the public agencies like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and state fish and game agencies putting some money in while also threatening to sue and just seeing what happens. Who's going to make some water available to keep fish in this stream? In the 1990s, major foundations like the Walton Family Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, the Ford Foundation began to put money into programs to increase awareness and actually acquire water rights for the environment. And we had the advent of local water trusts, which are now found everywhere. And we have at least one representative of Arizona Water Trust here in the room, but local water trusts that are very place-based, in contrast to national environmental organizations, have been very creative and very, very important all over the West now. And that's new in the last couple decades. And a lot of their support comes from foundations, but also from their local communities and donors, including water right holders who care about the quality of the environment in their area. And beverage companies in the private sector were pretty early to drop on. They could very easily see the link between clean drinking water supplies, healthy watersheds, and it being worthwhile to contribute some money to maintaining that. Now we have a whole nother level of corporate investment where any corporation that uses products in their supply chain, like maybe you're a textile company or even a clothing company, you're thinking, wow, cotton grown in Arizona, how's the water management there? In other words, companies are starting to think further back in their supply chain to the role that water plays and the potential risks that it imposes on them. For the beverage companies, that was pretty early, but now it's become far more extensive. And that's changed the game and kind of the amount of money that's available for water, for the environment, and for watershed management and kind of preventing wildfire, for instance, healthier forests. It extends to a much wider arena than just water in streams. The other thing that's happening that we have yet to really understand what its implications are going to be is that water, there's always been efforts, all the years I've been working in this, there's always been these little efforts to get some investment money and go get a water portfolio and watch it double in value and do really well. And usually it has not paid off. It's an extremely variable resource in terms of price and market value, and even some of the various hurdles that you would have to go through to buy water, hold it for speculation, and then have it available again later. But now big investment funds are acquiring water rights portfolios because they're anticipating that cities are going to be short. And of course, we do see that theme in the news quite a bit as well. So that's interesting. And some of what they're doing is acquiring water for the environment and holding it for a while. And then maybe later it'll be sold for other purposes. So this has introduced a really interesting element of uncertainty. And it's been fun to try to track this, very hard to get data on it. These are private investments. And finding the water rights part of it in the public databases, very interesting challenge.
Bonnie?
Yes.
Supplements.
Tribal nations have been incredibly important in this arena. I just refer to Arizona in this slide. 16 of the tribal nations in Arizona have quantified water rights through various processes, either through courts or through negotiated settlements or both. Most of those settlements provide for water for environmental purposes on the tribal homelands. So that's an important component of this too. And Arizona tribes have been incredibly active in terms of how they've thought about dedicating water to the environment, as well as sharing the risk of water supply shortages with their non-Indian neighboring irrigation districts and cities. So roles for economists now are to continue the valuation work that's been done for a long time. In what ways is water contributing in natural settings? But also these sophisticated contracts where we get farmers to alter their water use in very specific ways that minimize their reduced revenues from growing crops, and also that optimize the use of that water for environmental purposes, and payment mechanisms, paying people in a way that really sends good, clear incentive signals, and evaluating, are we doing this in a cost-effective manner, in a manner that's making good use of both the limited water and the limited money that's being put into this. So the emphasis on evaluation has really come to the fore, at least in my experience in these programs, just in the last few years. Evaluating environmental programs in general is this gnarly, difficult specialty, and evaluating environmental water acquisition programs is a subset of that. And funders want to know if their money is being well spent, so that's one of the impetus, and they're the ones who put together and hire the evaluation teams in most cases. How many of you, by the way, have experience with formal program evaluation? This doesn't count getting grades in classes, even though that is formal evaluation, but other kinds of programs. Okay, anybody associated with CLIMAS is familiar with this. It's kind of its own interesting world, and there's a growing body of practitioners, really smart, creative people who have a sense that, hey, we want to make sure we're doing this really well. How do we measure that? How do we document it? What kind of information do we need? Some of the challenges are systematically tracking transaction activity. if one of the games now that I think is very positive is individual agreements with farmers and irrigation districts. Well, those don't show up in a centralized database. You have to hear about them or have some way to track them. So tracking what's going on and being able to follow it year after year is part of the evaluation process. What kind of acquisitions are occurring? What's their nature? Paying farmers to reduce water consumption. Are they doing what they've always done and we're just paying them? Or are they really doing something different and we're getting new water out of this for the environment and in some cases for cities and other purposes too? And then the data, like absent and inscrutable are the words that occur to me. So when you see some of the metrics we're using, you'll see that, there's a lot of things that we don't have access to that we would like to. We want our metrics to be use inspired, that is, they can make a difference in running environmental water acquisition programs. An example would be a study that looks at what farmers have been receiving in terms of pricing compared to what is earned in their region growing that same mixture of crops, and kind of looking at the economic value range there. That can help with establishing prices that both reward farmers for participating as well as are cost effective for the program that's doing the buying and the paying out. The metrics need to be measurable based on accessible data and reasonable cost and timely way. And we want to be able to compare across time, across years, and also across programs and regions. So something that has data that's available relatively widely over a large area. There's three kinds of environmental water acquisition metrics. One are in the stream metrics, which I'll just refer to really briefly. One are policy metrics, like is the policy environment, the set of laws and rules changing in a way that's helpful, and economic metrics. So this is an example of an environmental flow permanence metric that we used for a creek in Oregon. And this was part of a 5-year project I was involved with, a team of academics, including several other economists, and the Nature Conservancy was a big part of it, and several foundations. And this particular graph is just showing of the water that is available. So actual stream flow is that jagged line. And then the stack of water available to provide that stream flow are these bars. So it was water that was permanently acquired in yellow. It was only available for 1 year at a time. So this sort of had to do with how permanent was the water that you'd managed to stack up to support this particular stream, which was an important salmon bearing stream. And that's just like a tiny little taste of the complexity of metrics that measure what's going on in the stream. You know, there's fish population, all kinds of other things that people do their best to measure. And then for environmental policy metrics, this is an example from a study produced by the Stanford Water in the West program that's really fun. You notice Arizona's score is the lowest of these 7 states. They were looking at the nature of the legal authorization for in-stream flow rights. Are they enforced? And are there procedural barriers or other things that states are putting in the way to dedicating water for the environment? So this was a really fun evaluation metric. I got to work with this team as well. It was mostly, again, legal components, not particularly economic, but it certainly sets the stage for what happens with in-stream flows. And then the scorecard approach, notice those grade letters at the end. So this is like the most complicated, and this is like this tiny little piece of a scorecard where you're looking at, well, how much water is actually moving out of agriculture a year, permanent, temporary, in-stream flow, segments of streams protected, and then number of transactions that are not buy and dry transactions. And we were instructed you have to produce a letter grade based on percent change year to year. It's like, wow, it kind of feels arbitrary. And it was really hard getting the data, but this is what in many settings now an environmental program scorecard would look like. Economic metrics are really important because if you move water from one use to another, you're moving jobs, you're moving business activity, you're moving the composition of what's happening in that regional economy. And when I talk about economic metrics, it's going to be very brief without a lot of technical detail, but there's a lot of fun stuff behind this. And if you're interested in it, be sure to get in touch with me. So here's one example of economic metric is the cost per acre foot of wet water, that is new water actually being available for environmental purposes. And these are lots of different acquisition programs. These happen to be for 2 streams in Oregon and Nevada. And you can see that the costs per acre foot of water generated are all over the map now, which is what you would expect in a program that's kind of in a pilot stage. where price is not well established, it's not many buyer, many seller kind of market setting. It's a negotiated setting, farmer by farmer and irrigation district by irrigation district. We also looked at economic productivity in agriculture. Again, this is a basin in Nevada, the Walker River, Wicas Creek is in Central Oregon. We were looking at uses of water for different crops and what that generates in terms of acres in those crops and revenues generated per acre over here. So revenues generated were actually going up on a per acre basis. Revenues generated in farming were going up when there was an environmental water acquisition program. Why? Because farmers were selling water that was used on the least productive fields and in the least productive crops, and the water that remained used in agriculture was generating a higher amount in this rough way of looking at it per unit of water. One of the things that we want to do is develop better measures of economic productivity for water. We want to think about how these programs affect regional drought resilience. What will it mean for regions that more water is in streams and wetlands when we come to really tight years? The effects of these programs on regional economies, jobs, businesses in the area, agricultural and non-agricultural. And also there's long a concern in the environmental movement in general and in dedicating water and money to environmental preservation is who's benefiting from it. How are those benefits spread across different cultural groups, minority groups versus dominant culture groups, and what if any are impacts on income spread in a region? So these are some questions that have been raised in hearings about this and with community activists, and this is something that we want to be able to investigate in more detail. I would say the biggest puzzle moving forward is that a lot of things that we'd really like to know, like how is this changing the nature of farming in this region? Or what kind of new livelihoods would we expect to come into this area as a result of some of these programs? A lot of that we don't have good data for yet. The things we really want to know are not yet measurable in many cases. The things that we can measure are like, okay, we've got a number, is it important and what does it tell us? So I think that's the #1 challenge that I find in working with evaluation. And we discuss all these things in my graduate courses, and a lot of you over in the room have taken those courses, so feel free to see me if you're curious about those as well. We're going to spend a little time for discussion here, and do you want to set the timer for?
The slide says I have to.
Yeah, set timer. So we'll take like 10 minutes for any questions or comments, and then turn it over to Gigi, and maybe there'll be more general discussion of both presentations at the end if there's time. But any comments, questions, clarifications?
So whether in developing the agreements or in evaluating, I'm curious about the challenges in Arizona that you've seen as compared to some other states.
So Arizona is particularly challenging in this region because unlike many other Western states, we don't regulate our water in a way that we protect surface water flows from nearby groundwater pumping. And so that means if I go to acquire a surface water right and pay good money for it to protect a stream, it's not clear that I'm going to be able to prevent groundwater pumping coming from in and eroding that investment I just made. So that's a big hurdle in Arizona, but as Bailey knows, since she represents one of the water trusts active here, there's a lot of creative approaches and a lot of good examples from Arizona on a relatively small scale of finding a way to keep water in rivers and streams. The Verde Valley is another interesting area where a lot of that is happening.
Can you comment on some of you mentioned some metrics are not measurable. And so I think that's very apparent in tribal communities in which the cultural impacts and how we value water within our traditional system is very unmeasurable. So is there any type of discussion that you've had with how to approach that when you're doing this type of analysis?
There isn't. It's always really a hard discussion. Like one discussion we had involved my work for the Hopi tribe on the pipeline for the coal slurry. This was some years ago. And there's important resources, springs that depend on groundwater on the Hopi reservation. Of course, many other areas of the West that have key cultural values, and groundwater pumping appeared to be having a negative impact on those springs. And somebody said, why don't we just go do a study among the Hopi communities of the value of the springs to them? I don't think that's a good idea. What we actually ended up doing was calculating the cost of getting the water in a different way from groundwater not linked to the springs. What would the additional costs be? And there were ads actually ran in the New York Times and a couple other newspapers. It ended up costing a nickel per household or some really small amount to get water from another source. So we did not, in that case, approach values as expressed by members of the tribal communities. We put out a cost figure to the larger public and said, hey, you know what? This isn't much. Why don't we just do this? So that doesn't directly address your question, but that was one of a number of interesting experiences of that. And I'm happy to talk more about that topic later.
We have a question from someone online. Might the upcoming Arizona Supreme Court decision on Federal Reserve water rights for the San Pedro help make the groundwater surface water connection in Arizona?
It definitely could.
Excellent.
We'll see. But even if the court rules in a way that's really clear, though, then you still need to develop regulations to implement that. So all by itself, it would not address the issue.
So on the bit about the scorecard, some panel wants to see to me A, B, C, or D, or whatever it is, and I can see you grinding your teeth about that. So is there an optional form for some sort of grade that you can give them that helps them integrate what you've done and give them a bigger picture than just a letter grade?
So what environmental organizations have done for years is you tell a heartwarming story and you show great pictures. Wow, look at what the stream looked like before. Yeah. Here's the farmer that altered the way they were growing alfalfa in order to put water in the stream. A couple other people speaking up about how good this has been for the region. So it was anecdote by anecdote to build up a good feel so the funders would keep writing checks. And I think that's important. We do actually want to feel good about the genuine trade-offs that are being made and the people are putting money into it. So the scorecard approach, it's true, you have seen me grinding my teeth about that and I'm ambivalent about it, but it seemed that it was necessary to go beyond the just tell a good story and show good pictures. And as an economist, I really like to think about resources being expended in a thoughtful way and being somewhat systematic. The scorecard I thought was a little extreme, but it's very organized. Lots of nice rows and columns. And that definitely is what the funders are requesting. Yeah. I could show a dozen scorecards like that on really complicated water for the environment issues that have been constructed in the last 2 years.
I've got one question. And maybe this relates somewhat to the groundwater and surface water as well too, but especially in the Northwest, like in the spring, there'll be, just basically excess water.
Yes.
And so that, when the farmers were irrigating, that was often viewed as a good thing because then, some of that percolation, whatever, especially if it's just flood irrigation, would come back, in August.
Yeah.
When it's really,
exactly,
dry and everything. But now that, people have switched to maybe more conservation, even just center pivots, I mean, how has that been valued and looked at in terms of, the legal side as well as the economic side?
Yeah. So rust race is a really important puzzle that has to be confronted. And this is a lot of early programs paid farmers to adopt different irrigation technologies, anything but flood and furrow irrigation, sprinkler, some even going to drip. So that meant they diverted less water from the stream in order to grow the same kinds of crops and crop yields, but there weren't the return flows, as you were just expressing. And some of those return flows had really nice time lags. In other words, you irrigate your field, the water slowly seeping under the field. It's still helping keep the soil moist in August when it's drier and things are getting tighter in terms of water supply. So new irrigation technologies and new irrigation patterns really do change that and has had repercussions. There's a number of programs that paid farmers, not in terms of reducing actual wet water use, consumptive use, but they paid for new irrigation technologies. Of course, USDA pays for adoption of new technologies, and it sometimes backfires in terms of effects on streams. So that's a hope of people who do this environmental water acquisition work is, can we coordinate better with the federal programs? Because a good amount of money is being spent. Could we refine those programs to account for exactly the problem that you just referred to?
I have another online question. Can you address ecological water as a beneficial use, particularly in Arizona, since it doesn't exist? Would recognition help to get more water for the environment in Arizona?
So this is a question from the legal point of view in that in general state legislation is needed to declare water as a quote beneficial use for which purposes a water right can be held, just like agriculture and municipal and mining and so on. And many states have explicit legislation for that purpose. But in Arizona, we do have these various ways to make water available for environmental purposes, and it's absolutely the case that clearer legislation at the state level would be helpful, but if we're not going to have it soon, which I would guess we're not, the things that we are able to do are pretty impressive. And Arizona was radical in very early in the 1970s. There was a court ruling that said there could be in-stream flow water rights, 1976 case, and private individuals could hold those. And a whole bunch of environmental organizations, not a whole bunch, a small number of environmental organizations went out and were able to establish in-stream flow rights in the 1980s. That was a court ruling. It was not the express wish of the Arizona legislature, which since then has passed legislation that make it a lot tougher in several technical legal ways to have senior in-stream flow rights. So great question.
I wish it was mine. You have about a minute for one more question.
Natalie.
Can you point to groups or people that are trying, in other words, to measure the immeasurable, and especially just to do more research, and especially I'm just curious how that intersects with private capital coming in, because it seems like some of the immeasurable are longer term, more subtle, yet significant, needs, and that versus often shorter term needs of capital.
Yes, I think we do. We've always had a tension between measurable financial aspects of how water is used, which has always been easy to document in agriculture and in urban use and industrial use and in mining and so on. But sort of the community aspects, even the recreation took a long time to develop. Oh, these are good, reliable measures of how people value recreation and what importance it plays in their region. So since I know Madeline and the kind of work she does, what occurs to me is measuring the immeasurables. Maybe it's not the measure of them, maybe it's something else. One of the really enjoyable events I've participated in over the years are music and poetry festivals organized around water. And maybe that's where some of that happens. Now, how does that fit into a scorecard? Probably not. But how do you get people inspired to be thinking carefully about this and advocating for things that they think will work well? That might be where that happens. So it may not be measuring measurables. It might be a whole nother approach.
Wow, you nailed the timing. And that is not that different than Carrie's question about cultural values. But are you still have one more slide or no?
Let's see. Switching gears to talk directly about CLIMAS. And if you haven't seen CLIMAS by the numbers yet, here you get to.
Gigi, I'm going to switch this for you.
Okay, thanks.